Hey, I'm Shane. In this video, I'm going to be talking all about macro photography. I'm going to be touching on the gear that you'll need, how to dial in the settings on your camera, and ultimately, how to start practicing on getting some stellar macro photos. So this video is going to be all about macro photography. It's going to be covering a huge range of topics, starting off with the principles of what macro photography really is, what you all need to get started, how to set up your gear and choose a subject, and then the settings that you'll need and how to really get started with getting some great macro photos. One thing I won't focus on in this video is macro video, because I actually made a whole nother tutorial on that topic already, which I'll have linked on screen now. I skip over a lot of the topics in that video that will be covered in this video though, so if you are looking to capture video, I suggest watching through this video first, because the principles of macro photography are really what you'll need to get started in video. So without further ado, let's get started. Beginning with the basics though, I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of what macro photography really is. And the idea is very simple. It's just taking photos of things that are very small and making them look very big. This is achieved by using specialized lenses that are able to magnify objects and get photos very close to the camera. In concept, it's very simple. However, in practice, it can be rather complicated to get good macro photos. This is because the closer you get to a camera and the lower your aperture is, the harder it is to get photos in focus of your subject. And you either have to choose between a blurry photo sometimes or an underexposed photo. And I'm going to talk about how to dial in these settings later in the video, but to get started, I'm going to talk about the gear that you're going to need first. It seems so often my videos devolve into talking about what gear you need. However, the equipment that you use for macro photography is really going to be the limiting factor in how far you're able to take the creativity and just the general quality of your images. The most essential things you're going to need is a camera with a macro lens. However, there's a few optional items such as extension tubes and magnifying lenses, as well as having a good tripod and potentially additional lighting. Starting off with which camera to use, thankfully is actually pretty irrelevant when taking macro photos. In the majority of the time, you're going to want to be using manual focus and fully manual mode on the camera, so your automatic settings don't matter or your autofocus. And sensor size is much less relevant with macro photography, though a full frame camera will have an edge because of the lower pixel density and larger sensor size. However, when you pair a crop sensor camera like a Micro Four Thirds or APS-C camera with a quality macro lens, you should be able to get very comparable results, and they're certainly more than adequate. The most important part of macro photography is having a good macro lens, and the focal length isn't actually that relevant. It's more focused on the minimum focusing distance, and more importantly, its reproduction ratio. The reproduction ratio is a combination of taking into account the minimum focusing distance and the lens's focal length, combining these all together to develop a fraction or a decimal of what the reproduction ratio is. Thankfully, you don't need to do this math though, because manufacturers do it for you, and you can often find it even on the packaging of the lens or on the camera manufacturer's website. The reason it's so important though is because even though a manufacturer might label a lens as a macro lens or having macro functionality, it doesn't mean it's a true macro lens. A true macro lens has a reproduction ratio of 1, meaning that when it takes a picture of a subject, it's able to reproduce that subject the exact same size as it is in real life on the camera sensor, which means you can blow it up very large. A lens with a reproduction ratio of 0.5 or 1 to 2 is able to reproduce a subject half the size on the camera sensor as it is in real life. This would still be branded as a macro lens, though it wouldn't have as much magnification as a true macro lens. This is why it's so important to look at the reproduction ratio, because not all macro lenses are made the same. There are even lenses that are able to have a 5:1 macro functionality, which are borderline microscopes. And companies like Laowa are really pioneering in this field in making more accessible ultra macro lenses. With that all said though, one thing you might have noticed if you're looking at macro lenses is how expensive they can be. And this is a really costly investment to make if you're looking into getting into macro photography. Thankfully though, there is an alternative. There are a lot of companies out there that make very high quality alternatives to macro lenses, such as extension tubes or actually magnifying lenses you put in front of your lens to help them get a closer minimum focusing distance. The catch of using these is that they limit your maximum focusing distance. So if I were to put them in front of a non-macro lens, they'd only be able to focus about a meter away. However, they'd be able to focus a meter closer a lot of the time, which is pretty darn big when you want to take macro photos. And they do diminish the quality of your images and reduce your autofocus functionality and can introduce more vignetting. However, they often only cost $20 to $100, which in itself is just a huge advantage. I made a separate video on these little accessories, and ultimately, if you're getting started with macro photography and you don't have a macro lens yet, I highly recommend you look into picking up just some cheap extension tubes, because for 20 bucks, their value is insane and they can really help you get started in learning the basics when you don't necessarily want to make that huge investment. And it's a really good way to kind of dip your feet in the water before diving in. The next thing that I really recommend is a tripod. It doesn't need to be fancy, and quite frankly, it can be just an itty bitty tabletop tripod, but just anything to keep your camera steady. This is even more important in video. However, for photos, especially while you're learning, having a tripod will help you really just get better photos off the start, because you have more control over how stable your camera is. The last concept I'm going to talk about is using additional lighting. And quite frankly, while you're getting started, I don't recommend using additional lighting and just keeping it simple. However, as you get more advanced with your macro photography, it's going to be the most important concept, because how much available light you have and being able to control that light is going to be what limits you creatively, and you'll find out very quickly how difficult it is to do so. But you can use anything from strobes, LED lighting, reflectors, or anything. And really just having more light is generally better. In this video though, I'm just going to focus on using window lighting, and I'm going to use some LED video lights just to help out with lighting me and the subject. However, when you're taking photos yourself, finding a nice window in the house to shoot by will provide you with often enough light to get a good photo. However, if you don't have a good window to go beside, I recommend going outside and just using the sun or daylight for your photos. One thing you'll notice is that indoor lighting, such as fluorescent, LED, or incandescent lights, often aren't going to be enough to get a well-exposed image. And it's just something that you have to keep in mind, is that you need a lot of light. Thankfully though, that's it for all the gear talk, and we can actually get started on using it all in practical situations. The first thing we'll need to do is to pick a subject. Really, my favorite thing to get macro photos of is bugs and wildlife and stuff outside. However, they are rather tricky to use in a video because they move and it's rather hard to get them stuck in one spot. And it's winter here in Canada, so there's nothing outside that's alive. So in this video, I'm going to be using an Xbox controller as a subject for my photos. Thankfully, it doesn't move and it's rather intricate, so it makes a good subject. I recommend just using like a plant or food or just some object you have laying around, because really just having something that is easy to work with is much easier when you're diving into the more complex settings involved with macro photography. Before you even get started though with taking photos, the first thing you're going to want to do is to put your camera into manual mode. This is because for macro photography, having control over your settings is absolutely essential, and being able to dial them in is going to result in you getting the best photos possible. The first setting and the most important setting to keep in mind is your aperture. And this is really the most important concept in all of macro photography because it's going to control your depth of field. If you set your aperture to f2.8 and take a photo, you can see how important it is because at your minimum focusing distance, your focal plane is only going to be pretty much a hair and your subject isn't going to be in focus at all. No matter how well you focus the image, it's just going to be such a shallow depth of field, it's impossible to work with. For this reason, often macro photography requires you to go down to f5.6 or f11 or higher in order to get enough of the subject in focus to get an actual visible image. And often having your aperture dialed in is going to be what results in the best photo possible. Your ISO and shutter speed are really just there to compensate for what aperture you're using. However, there are things you can do to maximize the quality of your images by having control over your shutter and ISO. Using a tripod is the easiest thing. This is because you can bring down your shutter speed a whole heck of a lot lower if you have your camera as stable as possible. Introducing a shutter delay or a timer to your photos also will allow you to reduce the amount of shake your hands impose on your camera while taking a photo. So if you have a shutter delay of even just 2 seconds, you can tap the shutter button, take your hands off the camera and stand very still to hope that your camera won't be shaking at all and it will get a very good photo that way. By having a slow shutter speed, you can keep your ISO as low as possible as well, because the higher you bring your ISO, the more grain you're going to introduce into your images and ultimately have a lower quality image. However, there's a lot of situations where you can't put your camera on a tripod or your subject is moving, and for that reason a tripod isn't going to work, such as taking photos of photos while they're blowing in the wind or just a bug or something. In these situations, it's important to understand how low your shutter speed can go before you start having a blurry image. And this depends entirely on the camera, the focal length of your lens, if you have image stabilization, but often having a shutter speed of 1/100th is rather safe. But some modern cameras can go even lower than that, or some older cameras or crop sensor cameras might require you to go a little bit higher, unfortunately. One thing you can do to help compensate for this though is using flash, because using a flash or some sort of strobe lighting will help freeze the subject, even though your shutter speed might not be as fast as the flash is firing. This can result in sharper images with a lot more light in them, which allows you to also, again, use a higher shutter speed and a lower ISO to sharpen up the image. A lot of the time, what it comes down to though, is just practice. And as it's obvious by all the settings I discussed, it's all about being able to dial in your settings on the fly. So when you have a controlled environment indoors, it's the best situation to practice in because it's going to allow you to really figure out what each setting does, and then you can take those settings out into the field and practice on moving subjects so that you can really just get a better grasp and become more fluid in understanding of what each individual setting does. That's going to be it for this video though. I hope to make more videos on the topic of macro photography, and I can dive into things such as focus stacking, ultra macro photography with high magnification lenses, or topics such as product photos, wildlife photography, or even just flowers or just fun stuff like that. If you have any ideas or requests, please let me know in the descriptions, because as you can probably tell, I'm pretty passionate about macro photography and I really enjoy making videos on this topic. If you have any questions about anything I said in this video, again, please leave a comment below because I try and answer all the questions that I have, and it's just nice to have a good conversation about the topic. If you enjoyed the video though, please consider subscribing to my channel and liking the video because it goes a really long way in helping me make more videos like this. These aren't sponsored videos and I only make money off of ad revenue. And yeah, that's kind of it at this point. So Your support means a lot and it helps me make stuff I like to make. Anyways, I hope you have a great day and all the best with your macro photography. See you in the next video.